Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 3. This chapter is entitled, Heaven Furnishes Stephen with a Problem. The Lenten fast was over. Stephen and his handful had sung the first glorious Alleluias of Easter and were exulting with the triumphantly risen Christ. Their band was small now, smaller than it had ever been. But the air of glad expectancy that had filled Citeaux the day Stephen had his visit from Felix still lifted every heart in the monastery. They, too, prayed for patience, even as had their abbot. But each succeeding day, full of bright hope though it was, wore their patience thinner and thinner. The austerities of the season of special penance had not robbed their expectancy of its edge. But with the dawn of Easter, a new calm seemed to settle on all, even on the abbot. One afternoon, not long after that first glad Alleluia had burst from their joyous throats, Stephen was at his desk studying the recension he had made of the Bible. He was deep in his work when there came a sharp, nervous knock on his door, and the breathless porter burst in with the shout, "They have come!" The abbot looked up. He had been far away in his thoughts. "Who?" he asked calmly. "The men of noble birth and learning." The book fell from Stephen's hands. He felt his pulse quicken. "How many?" he asked. 32, cried the excited porter. Stephen walked to the gate as calmly as he could, but the effort was noticeable. Color glowed in his usually pale cheeks, while his eyes were unnaturally bright and sparkling. The porter swung the door open, and 32 noblemen saw a stately abbot step into the frame and smile. It was all that Stephen could do at the moment. Before him stood nobles ranging from the tender age of 13 to that of over 50 years. Stephen saw them through a tremulous mist. Tears of joy refused to be stemmed. With wonder, he learned that these men were all knitted by the ties of blood and intimate friendship. Their spokesman was a handsome, light-haired, large-eyed, trimly built lad of 22. His name was Bernard. He had come from Fontaine. He was scion of one of Burgundy's best families. Behind him stood 4 of his brothers, one of his uncles, some of his cousins, and many of his lifelong friends. The one question he asked was, "May we come in?" Stephen blinked. Could they come in? Ah, if only he were French, he could answer that with an effusion. Could they come in? For years he had been waiting and praying. For weeks he had been watching. And today, could they come in? Stephen was sorry he was not French. He wanted to be voluble. He wanted to make expressive gestures and have a flood of warm words flow from his lips. They were all there in his heart. But all he could do was smile and say, "Yes, come in." But this one? No, I fear he is too young. He touched Bernard's young cousin, Robert. The lad was only 13. Many things happened to Stephen Harding's heart that afternoon in Eastertide when he stood framed in the doorway greeting Bernard with his band. It responded to the freshness and warm appeal of youth, the dignity of sober, steadfast, middle-aged, and the gray hairs of warrior Gauldry, Bernard's maternal uncle. Most of all, it was overwhelmed with the fidelity and goodness of God. That night, he tried to appreciate what had happened. It was difficult. What a band of novices had come. Knights had laid aside sword and spear. Nobles had left wives and children. Youth had left life, adventure, romance in the world, and all had come to little Citeaux to seek God alone. From that day, Citeaux changed. New life pulsed in her veins. A more vibrant tempo beat in her choral song, and a younger heart throbbed at her manual labor. And from that day, Citeaux's abbot changed. He grew young again. A happier light came into his eyes, a more musical ring to his voice, and a greater spring to his step. It was then that Stephen began his greatest work, the molding of the greatest man of the 12th century and the greatest glory of Citeaux, young Bernard of Fontaine. He had sensed that fact the moment his porter had opened the door, and he had heard the light voice of the young Burgundian noble. He had sensed it with a touch of fright, but it was a challenge to his manhood, a stimulus that made him seek out God the Father for strength, God the Son for wisdom, and God the Holy Spirit for light. Springtime filled the woodlands and the heart of Stephen of Citeaux. He walked to the cemetery morning after morning to bring Alberic news of the hoped-for men of nobility and learning who had come to them. He told the Silver Lance that some of them were crusaders' sons, and that all of them had the crusader spirit. Told him how he must now set to work teaching them to make God the focal point of their thoughts and affections. With a smile, he used the phrase so dear to Robert and Alberic, God-oriented. With God's help, he would do that. He would God-orientate these men. It was not the difficult task he expected, for he soon saw that their environment and education had worked on their souls. Before the month was out, Stephen had learned how much a mother can do to the mind and heart of children. Secretly, the abbot admitted that Alice of Montbar, wife to Tescelin of Fontaine, and mother of Bernard and his brothers, had been master of novices for this select group. But Stephen was wise enough to realize that heaven had furnished him with a problem. He knew that these men would be tempted. He knew that the lowly life at Citeaux would not be easy for Gaudry, the knight and noble who had left castle, vassals, and wealth. No, it would not be easy for him to take orders and work like a serf. Nor would it be easy for Guy, Bernard's eldest brother, who had left wife and 2 charming baby girls. It would not be easy for him to live alone in silence. Nor would it be easy for Bernard's other brothers, Gerard and Andrew. They had been knighted and had already tasted the heady wine of triumph in battle. Indeed, it would be difficult for such men to rest satisfied with the dull, prosaic life of following a plow. And so for the rest of the 30, it would not be easy. But Stephen must find a way to make it less hard. And he did. He found the only way. He found him who said of himself, "I am the way." How Stephen's solution worked is the fascinating story of The Family That Overtook Christ, a continuation of this saga of Citeaux. Here it is enough to say that Stephen presented his solution early, clearly. What he especially impressed on them was the fact that Christ was a man. Hence, they were to take for their motto, "Act manfully." Do everything for God in a virile way. That would be the Christ way. For practical purposes, he brought it down to do well what you're doing. Be intent on the task of the moment. Bend heart and mind and all your energies on that one thing to the utter exclusion of everything else. It was a simple lesson, and one that was easily learned, for it was thoroughly taught, and these men, most of whom had spent their lives in the saddle with a mettlesome charger between their knees and a spear or mace in their hands, took the lesson Stephen taught them and twisted it into a battle cry. They used it the rest of their lives. It steadied them when they were wavering. It spurred them on when their energies flagged. It blew the fire in their souls to brilliant flame when they needed flame. It was all for God. When Stephen saw how quickly they grasped the lesson and caught the spirit of Citeaux, when he saw how in one lightning sword thrust they had pierced to the very heart of St. Benedict's rule, he knelt down humbly and from a grateful heart poured out fervent thanks to God for having sent men, real men, men of nobility and learning. But that was only the beginning of the problem heaven had presented for Bernard of Fontaine, for Bernard of Fontaine had started something. When Burgundy learned that the Lord of Fontaine was alone in his castle with his only daughter and his youngest son, there was a mighty stirring. Tournaments still went on, and young nobles were knighted, but the attention of the duchy was not on these things alone. The air became alive with talk of the abbey lost in the swampland. The leading topic of conversation was neither the latest champion of the tourneys, nor the fairest lady. It was Bernard, his band, and little Citeaux. Day after day, knighthood grew more and more conscious of a higher chivalry, and courtiers learned that there was a place for them behind cloister walls. At the moment, the soldiers of the duchy were laying siege to Grancy, but even this was no deterrent to nobles who had caught the spark from Bernard, to knights who had been stirred by young Andrew, nor to older warriors who knew Guy and Gaudry. There were many heated arguments. Charges of desertion and fanaticism were leveled against those who would imitate the men of Fontaine. But despite the sting of taunts and the ridicule of the unheeding, old and young kept going to Citeaux. Week after week, the iron knocker on the abbey gate was lifted and resolutely banged by men who were used to battle and who were ready to fight. Week after week, Stephen Harding welcomed new novices and found among them crusader sons ablaze with the crusader spirit. Week after week, he welcomed not only men of nobility and learning, but also ignorant men, men of the soil and serfdom. Both he welcomed equally. Abbot Stephen could hardly believe it. He saw his problem grow, but he was not afraid. He would find a solution in time. At the moment, he was satisfied to be humbled, and more than once he walked to the cemetery to tell Alberic and the others of the wonder that was taking place, and to beat his breast as he said, "And to think I actually doubted." But beating the breast was not enough when the influx continued and little Citeaux became overcrowded. What should he do? Was this sudden flow after the long years of drought a mere spring freshet? Would it stop with the summer? Should he enlarge the abbey? Would the postulants stay? These were some of the questions that turned in Stephen's mind as he paced the cemetery paths. He remembered that it was here, on these very paths, that he had first been startled by the realization that Robert and Alberic had really created something distinct. It was here, on these very paths, that Stephen decided to complete that creation. He would not enlarge the abbey. He would enlarge the order. Yes, he said, pacing more rapidly, order it is going to be. He had seen it coming before Alberic died. It is true that he had doubted when death had emptied stall after stall with chilling regularity, and the iron knocker on the abbey gate was silent. But that was his sin. He was making reparation for it now. He talked earnestly to the dead as he paced the paths, and he heard the dead talking to him. He talked to the lay brothers who had so edified him and encouraged him. He talked to the men who had died under him as abbot. Finally, he talked long with Brother Felix, the man he had commanded to come back from the dead, and who had come back. He said, "The applicants are like bees swarming, Felix. It is time for some to fly away and spread themselves to other parts." With Stephen, to think had ever been to act. He had reasoned the situation out thoroughly. He had arrived at his conclusion. So one morning in the early May of 1113, when the grass was thick and very green in the mounded cemetery, the abbot knelt at the grave of the silver lance. His face was rigid. After kneeling like stone for a moment, he said slowly, "Tomorrow, Alberic, they go. Crusader sons with the crusader spirit." With eyes fixed on the turf as if he were looking into the face of his friend, he went on. "You remember Bertrand. He came with us from Moulins. I am giving him a cross tomorrow and 12 men. They go south. They are to take up their abode by the Grosny. Walter, Bishop of Chalon, and 2 noblemen gave us the land. It is a goodly stretch. This will be our first foundation. Let us call it La Ferté, or firmitas, and let us pray that it be strong, that it be true to all we have worked for. Alberic, he continued, your silver lance must lead the way so that my Grecian column may arise. These men know the cause and the commander. See to it that the secret spot which you say lies deep in every man be touched. See to it that La Ferté be a home for shields for the Sacred Heart. See to it that poverty, simplicity, and solitude be the guiding principles and the leading stars. Tell Robert that stars are beginning to come out after dark. The next day they left. Bertrand was at the head, bearing a large cross. Behind him trailed 12 silent monks. Many who saw them were struck by the number and spoke of Christ and his 12. That was the very idea behind the number, and that was the spirit that animated the group. That was the day on which Citeaux became a mother. Her daughter, her first daughter, was living in the south. Stephen Harding rejoiced in the solution he had found for heaven's problem. But as the months mounted, he soon saw that the problem was far from being fully solved. Postulants kept lifting that heavy iron knocker on the abbey's front gate, and the church, the refectory, and the dormitory kept being overcrowded. The bees were still swarming, as Felix had foretold. But the problem became more intricate for the abbot. The veterans of early Molem and even of early Citeaux were few, and not all of them were leaders. Whom did he have to place at the head of a band, and where should they go? Stephen grew worried. One day he called Gaudry to him and very bluntly said, "You know something of men. Is Hugh of Macon a leader?" The old warrior chuckled. "Men are different animals to lead, Reverend Father. In fact, they don't like to be led." Then rather musingly he went on, "The real leader of men is the man who can make others believe they are accompanying him, not following. He is the man who is wise enough to recognize, respect, and show due deference to the manhood in other men. He is the man who wins their confidence by showing his confidence in them." Then, with a quick lift of his eyes to his abbot, he said, "Not many men are that wise, but I think young Hugh of Macon is." Stephen smiled. "Don't you demand real superiority in your leaders?" "Oh, it's got to be there," said Gaudry quickly, "but it must not be paraded. Men demand superiority in their leaders, but at the same time they resent being made inferior. So the true superior is the man who makes inferiors feel equal, even though they know in their heart of hearts that they are not. This honest duplicity is one of human nature's queerest quirks. But why do you ask about Hugh?" The abbot drew out a map of France and placed beside it a list of the community. "We've got to make sense out of these two confusing things." Placing his stylus on an inked X, he said, "This is Citeaux. South here we have La Ferté. As a soldier, where would you say our next daughter house should be placed?" Gaudry glanced from his abbot to the map, then back to his abbot again. "It depends on what you want to do, Reverend Father. If you want to defend Citeaux, you would surround her on all sides and keep your daughters close to home. If you want Citeaux to expand, you've got to do two seemingly contradictory things. You've got to radiate even as you attract." The abbot smiled. It was good to be plotting with one who knew how to plot. "You've outlined my principles even before I've presented them, Gaudry. I want union. That's fundamental. But obviously, as you look at this list, I've got to have expansion." "That's phrasing it more exactly than I did, Reverend Father. Here then is our center. This will be the hub of the wheel." And the old soldier placed his finger on Citeaux. You've already got one spoke down here in the south, and he indicated La Ferté. Now you need 3 others, one here, and one right here, and his finger touched spots to the north, east, and west of Citeaux. That will give you the union and expansion you desire. I speak of a wheel, for I think of the 2 forces in a revolving wheel. You see the application of the hub. We've got to hold our daughters to Citeaux, even as we send them out to the circumference of the circle, and his finger traced an arc through the points he had indicated. But you spoke of radiating and attracting. What do you mean? Practically the same thing. You see, Reverend Father, I've watched the steady stream of postulants come here. Citeaux is attracting them. And now Citeaux can radiate because of them. She has started already with La Ferté in the south. But now, if she is to continue to grow, La Ferté and every other daughter house must attract even as does Citeaux. In that way, only they will be able to radiate. Therefore, you've got to place your houses as near as you can to the intersections of different dioceses, on the border of different provinces, and fairly near to populous centers. That's what a soldier would do. Stephen bent over the map. He studied the position of La Ferté. She stood close to the intersections of the dioceses of Macon and Chalon. Her position then was fairly satisfying. The abbot now placed his stylus on a spot where 3 provinces met: Auxerre, Tonnerre, and Champagne. Look at this, Gaudry. This spot is not only tangent of 3 provinces, but also to 3 dioceses. I could set a table there and seat the bishops of Sens, Langres, and Auxerre to dinner without having any one of them leave his own diocese. Do you think that would be a favorable spot for a foundation? Gaudry squinted at the point, smiled, and said, "Excellent." "All right," said Stephen as he pushed the map aside and drew over the community list. "Now for the men. How does one train commanders, Gaudry?" "One doesn't," replied the old soldier. "We learn to walk by walking. We learn to command by commanding." Then he chuckled as he said, "We learn everything by making mistakes. The stumbles, falls, and bumps of babyhood were our most expert instructors in the art of walking, Reverend Father, and I more than suspect that our errors of judgment, our too hasty orders, and our humiliating defeats best teach us how to command. But something is worrying you, Reverend Father. What is it?" "Time," said Stephen. "Are they sufficiently trained? Are they grounded in the simplicity, the poverty, and the solitude that are the bases of our spirit? Do they love prayer and penance?" "Halt!" commanded Gaudry as he smiled at his superior. At Stephen's look of surprise, the old warrior said, "Your last question was wrongly phrased, Reverend Father. Nobody loves penance. Nobody can love penance. And I'd almost dare say the same thing for certain forms of prayer. They love the God to whom they pray, and the God to whom they pay reparation, but they do not and cannot love penance." "Become a philosopher in your old age, eh?" No, Reverend Father, becoming God-conscious, that's all." "Well, what do you think, Gaudry? Do you think Hugh of Macon could lead 12 men to the spot I pointed out and have them live there as we are living here?" The old warrior thought a long time before his gray head nodded in assent. "As well as any man you've got on that list," he finally said. "But I must tell you that if you send him away, you'll be sending away half of young Bernard's heart. They have been the fastest of friends since childhood." "I've thought of that," said Stephen slowly. "But Bernard must get used to having his heart broken. It seems part of God's technique in the sculpting of his saints, Gaudry. He breaks the human heart again and again, but only to refashion it closer to his own. Who knows but that is the secret of the 7 swords that were scabbarded in Mary's immaculate breast. Sanctity costs, doesn't it? came the slow question from the warrior, whose eyes were looking far, far away. Yes, said Stephen quickly. It costs much. But Galdry, the price is always in our purses. We fail to purchase it not because we are poor, but because we are miserly. We won't pay the price. Here is a perfect example of how easy it is to purchase sanctity if we will. This separation between Bernard and Hugh is going to hurt. Now they can react naturally or supernaturally. They can take that hurt and nurse it, pout over it, groan and lament over the loneliness and lovelessness in the religious life, or they can smile outwardly even as inwardly they smart. They can cheer one another on as they part, even as they secretly tell Christ to take the pain that is in their soul and use it as incense to be burned in the brazier of his sacred heart and offered to the Godhead in praise and reparation. To do this latter thing does not take away the sting. No, indeed. It often increases because of the very denial of the relief that would come from an outward expression of human grief. But you know which of the two ways is the virtuous way? You know which will make the man of God and which the maudlin monk. Yes, Galdry, sanctity costs, but we always have the price. The only question is, will we pay it? Galdry rose on that question. Thank you, Reverend Father, he said. You have shown me a valuable truth. Sanctity has always appeared some distant, practically unattainable thing to me. Because it is supernatural, I suppose, I believed that it had little relation to the natural me. I see now how dull I have been. I see now that my sanctity must be bought with the coin I make from the metal of my everyday actions and reactions. I also see that Bernard and Hugh must amend their sorrow. Then slowly he added, Perhaps that is the easiest of all metals to work on, Reverend Father. My difficulty in coining the pleasure God sends me. My difficulty is coining the pleasure God sends me. The abbot looked long at the old warrior who had gray at his temples and sincerity burning as bright as silver in his eyes. Then he smiled warmly. Galdry, he said, if the youngsters have learned as well as you, I can put aside all my worries. They will be gallant to God. That's a very choice compliment, Reverend Father, said the nobleman with a bow. I thank you for your kindness, but must refuse to accept the praise. Those youngsters have learned faster and more fully than I. We must wait and see, said Stephen as the old warrior left. A week later, Hugh of Macon shouldered a 5-foot wooden cross and with 12 men marching behind him, walked west to Pontigny. Citeaux had her second daughter, and there was a little more room at the mother house. That was in 1114. But 1115 gave Stephen little rest. The influx of novices had been greater than ever. Busy as he was with their training, he did not forget his own plan for the order. He talked the situation over with Galdry a few times, but nothing new came out of the discussions. The plan of a wheel with Citeaux as its hub was Galdry's fixed plan. Whenever Stephen spoke of leaders, the old warrior always pointed to younger men. They had the daring, he said, and daring was needed for such an enterprise as this. Old men were too cautious. That his abbot took his advice was evidenced the day Arnold of Cologne was selected to lead a group of 12 to the east. He founded the Abbey of Mormond, which lay close to the dioceses of Toul, Langres, and Besançon. Galdry's plan was being very closely followed. Then, before the year was out, Stephen did one of the most human things of his saintly career. Over the protests of some of the elders, he called Bernard of Fontaines to him, and despite his youth, his delicate health, and his exaggerated zeal, he made him the leader of the group that was to go north. In that group were his uncle Galdry, his 4 brothers, Guy, Gerard, Andrew, and Bartholomew, and 7 of his cousins and intimate friends. It was a very select group. Had Bernard been allowed his own choosing, he would have named the very 12 the abbot had designated. Just before the group gathered for departure, Gaudry went to the abbot's room and said, "Some of God's saints can be very human persons, can't they, Reverend Father?" The abbot smiled. "That's a very considerate thing you are doing for Bernard and his brothers." "And how about his uncle?" asked Stephen with a broader smile. "His uncle has a puzzle, Reverend Father. You see, he wants to become a saint, and one time you said that to make his saints, God breaks their human hearts so that he can remodel them on his own divine one. Now Gaudry's heart is not broken by this appointment." Stephen arose, and as they made their way to the door, he said, "When I was a boy, I heard an old farmer say, 'Never count your chickens before they are hatched.' When I was a young man, I heard an old sailor say, 'There is always a calm before the storm.' Now that I am an aging monk, I know that he is a very wise man who, in time of consolation, prepares his soul for desolation. Watch your heart action the next few years, Gaudry." The old warrior smiled. A few minutes later, his smile was forgotten in surprise as he watched the usually undemonstrative Stephen Harding break down in tears as he bade the little group farewell. When he heard the humble abbot begging young Bartholomew to pray for him, Gaudry said to himself, "I had forgotten that someone else's heart was engaged in this affair. It looks as if God is still at his sculpting."